Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In the series on sociological theory, in today's lecture, we're going to discuss Pierre Bourdieu. We're trying to understand a contemporary social thinker in order to understand both of how he kind of revises some of the classical sociological thinkers and makes sociology more in terms of a balance between empirical and theoretical practice. So to begin with, Pierre Bourdieu was a French sociologist, but more than a sociologist, he was a public intellectual. What does this mean? This means that he was recognized for his contribution to the public current affair as well as more traditional academic endeavors. Bourdieu was a thinker whose concepts helped shape general sociological theory, and mainly his contribution was in the field of sociology of education, the sociology of taste, class and culture. His work has been imperative in the other fields such as media, cultural studies, anthropology and the understanding of arts and aesthetic. Bourdieu in his lifetime wrote an extensive amount of books and articles, but some of his notable work for which he is known are The School as a Conservative Force. Here he is going to look into the role of an educational system in terms of creating a field which would be enabling for the student. This work was published in 1966. The second work is Outline of a Theory of Practice, published in 1977. The third book is Reproduction in Education, Society and Culture, and the fourth is Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. Fifth, Forms of Capital. Sixth, Language and Symbolic Power. So basically all his books are more or less well read by both students of sociology and people intellectual. But the most important classical work is Distinction, where he kind of develops the understanding of how the taste is something that is not necessarily limited to physiological or individual, but it is kind of connected to the social milieu in which one is growing up. So when we look into his theories, specifically his contribution to sociology and how he has kind of helped us look at some of the concepts which was there, but it had to be seen in the contemporary society. So his theory has to be seen with reference to the method, and he makes an effort to combine both theory and empirical data. He also pioneered methodological frameworks and terminology. Some of the terms which we kind of reckon to the contribution of Pierre Bourdieu are the concept of cultural capital, symbolic power, concept of habitus, field, and also in terms of looking into the revisiting of Marx and Weber on the concept of class. Bourdieu extended the idea of capital to categories such as social capital, cultural capital and symbolic capital. So earlier, prior to Bourdieu, the capital was kind of limited to the understanding of economy or material wealth of individual. He expands it to include the realm of culture and symbolism. Bourdieu saw sociology as a weapon against the social oppression and injustice, commenting that sociology is a combat sport insofar as it is used to defend against the domination of symbolic system. So he is kind of not only talking about documenting grand theories or kind of making great commentaries on the society, but also kind to convert the idea of how society functions into practice in terms of being able to realize how inequality is reproduced, how the idea of taste, distinctions, field, habitat are something which is leading to the development of inequality, and as sociologists our task is to reflect on these and make way to kind of bring about an egalitarian society. So we in this lecture are going to look into some of the main concepts here. The focus is to understand the 4 important areas, terminologies used by Pierre Bourdieu. These are habitus. Then we will look into the concept of cultural capital. The third is the idea of the field, and fourth is the concept of symbolic power or symbolic capital. So let us first try to understand what Bourdieu meant by the concept of habitus. Bourdieu sees power as culturally and symbolically created. So when we look into the definition of power by classical sociologists, it was the ability to take into the action of others or command of others because of the position of being in authority. Here Bourdieu says that power is created within the society. It has a symbolic meaning for those who are in a position of power and those who are impacted by it. And this constantly re-legitimized through the interplay of agency and structure. So it's kind of not only the institutionalization of power which is important, but what is important is to understand that those who have power are getting this legitimacy from the structure and are in turn able to play out the power, become the agency of the power that they have. So the main way this happens is through what he calls habitus, or socialized norms or tendency that guide behavior and thinking. This is what he means by the idea of habitus, that these are learned and it depends a lot to the milieu in which one is being born. So we see that if a child is born into a political family, slowly and gradually the personality becomes a dominant. He tries to he or she will be dominant in his peer group. So what happens is, it is not only in terms of your internal development of the body, but it also depends a lot in terms of the interaction with the outside world. So habitus is the way society becomes deposited in person in the form of lasting disposition or trained capacity and structured propensity to think, feel and act in determined way, which then guides them. So this is the definition of habitus from according to Pierre Bourdieu. So what he means is that it is created socially and culturally. So it's a collective development rather than an individual process. So it is not to be understood per se an individual personality, but has to place that individual within the social cultural milieu in which the person is growing up. So it leads to a certain kind of pattern that are enduring and transferable from one context to the another, but that also shifts in relation to specific context and over time. So it's not something which is static. It is not necessarily that it kind of handed over from one generation to the other. There will be a lot of transformation. There will be a lot of shift in the way it is played out. Habitat is not fixed or permanent and can be changed under unexpected situation over a long historical period. Habitus is neither a result of free will nor determined by structure, but created by a kind of interplay between the two over time, dispositions that are both shaped by past events and current practices. So it is a kind of a continuum, it's a continuity from the past, and that is why over a period of time, certain ways, certain behaviors of a particular class gets legitimized. And once it gets legitimized, it is taken for granted. Then that becomes the disposition with which the members of that particular group has to live. So that, however, there could be certain historical process or there could be certain events which could bring about a change in the habitus. So a person's habitus is how they would react to a given situation based on how they have reacted to things previously. So he is actually trying to kind of have a justification to the behavior that one does, and that's not a kind of explained as a prompt action. How an individual will respond to a situation or to a conversation would depend on the way it has been done or dealt in the previous situation or in a particular time which has been handed down. It has been kind of responded or structured in a certain manner. In the right circumstances, our habitus can help us navigate different environments. So we consider a person who grew up impoverished, so grows up in a rough neighborhood or grows up in kind of poverty. If they get a low paying job and continue to live in an unstable neighborhood, their life experience, skills and habits would enable them to survive this difficult situation. So if a kind of lesson or the kind of socialization that happens if one is born into a poor or an impoverished family is to always to learn with difficult situation. So if he kind of continues to grow up and continues with that poverty, the experience of the past would enable them to grapple with the difficult situation. So in this sense, habitus is created and reproduced unconsciously, without any deliberate pursuit of coherence, without any concentration. So according to Bourdieu, habitus also includes our taste and preferences for cultural objects such as food, art and clothing, which are shaped by our social status. So many times in our conversation with our friends, with relatives, we see that certain people who grow up in a certain class develops a taste for a certain, say, a particular brand or for a certain kind of food. So this is also the outcome of the habitus in which that individual is developed. And then there could be the comment coming in that because one is born into such a family, his taste is such, and their class differentiation starts coming in. So in this work, Distinction, published in 1984, Bourdieu suggests that taste is culturally inherited and not innate. So in his work, he tries to connect aesthetics judgment to positions in social space. So if there is a kind of demand for a certain particular brand, so why is there a certain kind of a demand for one particular brand and that brand kind of becomes a little expensive, is to cater to the taste of a particular high class. So if it is kind of considered selling below average product, then it will not be aligned with the taste of an upper class, and that kind of is a disconnection between the habitus and the taste, and that is how the distinction is made between people with certain kind of a taste and others who lack that taste. So upper class individual appreciates high art, because they are accustomed to it. They are part of their everyday life. They've been part of it. They have seen it. They have been witnessing others in their group to appreciate certain kind of art. While if we saw that particular piece of art where to a poor boy or a working class, the person will not be able to appreciate the piece of art. Why? Because his habitat is not kind of similar to the upper class who has developed a taste, a particular taste for a particular kind of an art. So the person from the lower class would kind of not be able to kind of understand why that piece of art is being applauded or appreciated by the other group. So that is the distinction between the taste which can develop depending on the habitus to which an individual belongs. So assigning taste to natural preferences are not learned habitus. It kind of also help us to understand the development or the justification of social inequality, So we know that if we look into the city life, that there are certain space in the city which is kind of identified as belonging to the upper class, and they are excluded to the people from the lower class. So as a result, we see the justification of social inequality through the ideas of taste, distinction and habitat. Bourdieu argues that because it assumes that some people are naturally more to be cultured while others are not. So your taste is also symbolically giving the meaning that because a particular class is doing their action in a certain way, that is cultured, and an opposite is kind of assigned to people from the other class who are not doing the things in that particular manner, so they are uncultured or they are not cultured. So here we know his most approach that comes into is that we are here not necessarily making a distinction between the two category of people in terms of the material wealth. What is also important, and that's an important contribution of Pierre Bourdieu, is the concept of cultural capital. So cultural capital a major factor in social mobility. For example, getting a higher paid job, a higher status on the basis of language. So you know that you are kind of born into a family which kind of invests a lot in terms of a particular kind of skill or particular line of language. So you are able to acquire the skill and language. It is not necessary that the family's income is kind of puts into a higher class category, but yet the investment in the culture, that is the culture of education, has been high, and that enables the individual to rise up in mobility by getting a high status or a high paid job. So the capital here is not necessarily restricted to the idea of economy. When we look into his work, it does make us refer to the three main varieties. Economic capital, which is understood in terms of the income and ownership. Social, which is basically understood as connections. And cultural is the informal education, cultural object and credentials. So these are all resources, either it be material resource or it be social resources, and third it could be your cultural resource. So these capital can be measured in two dimensions. One is the quantity of the capital, which is we can measure the class by the income level. The other is the structure. So the structure would be more in terms of the cultural capital. So particular agent may possess more or less amount of capital, and this capital may be structured in different proportion. Cultural capital includes knowledge, skills, values, taste and behavior that are considered desirable and or necessary to succeed in life. Example, having a high university degree or highbrow interest like classical music and art house film. So the whole idea is that it is not necessarily something which is there in that class as a whole, but a family can invest on it. So many a time say in India, the emphasis is on English education, the language of English. So the family stresses on convent education or English medium education, and that becomes the cultural capital of the family, because on the basis of that education, the child is able to get a higher paid job than the father or the grandfather's generation. Cultural capital is created and transferred from one other forms of capital and thus plays a central role in societal power relations. This provides the means for a non-economic form of domination and hierarchy, as classes distinguished themselves through taste. The shift from material to culture and symbolic forms of capital is to a large extent what hides the causes of inequality. So these are all resources, but there is not a clear-cut distinction, because they kind of dependent on each other. There is a lot of overflow from one to the other. Social capital creates social network and contacts, then create opportunities for advancement and success. Example, being personally acquainted with someone in a company who can recommend you for a job or internship. That's the social capital. Bourdieu believed that having similar taste, behavior, qualification defines one's position in society and creates a shared identity like a social class does. To have to show a sense of belongingness, there is a requirement to kind of upgrade your taste and your behavior and the quality. So these becomes the external markers of belonging to a particular class. Now, when we talk about cultural capital, or when we talk about capital, the idea is to understand how capital is linked to inequality. So, if we kind of understand that the social and cultural capital are key source of inequality among class, this is because the middle class has higher access to cultural and social capital than the working class and is dominant in society. Now, the cultural capital kind of is dependent on the economy conditions. So, for example, the family may be kind of having that capital to invest on the education of the children, but the economic means are not sufficient. So, if they kind of doesn't have the basic necessity to survive, then the investment on the cultural capital is negligible, and there's a vicious circle where poverty kind of continues. Bourdieu applied this concept of cultural capital to understand the way in education and the school system works. He points out at how schools and academic operate on middle class cultural norm and in their interest. This meant that the middle class students are more likely to be academically succeeded, retaining their societal advantages, while working class students are prevented from moving up the ladder. So, when we look into it, there is the whole idea of material and cultural capital kind of leads to some kind of inequality. When considering cultural capital specifically, Bourdieu added that it has three characteristics. It can be embodied, objectified, and institutionalized. The third concept is the concept of field, and in his theory he says that there are various social and institutional arenas in which people express and reproduce the disposition and where they compete for the distribution of different kinds of capital. A field is a network, a structure or set of relationship which may be intellectual, religious, educational, cultural. People are often experiencing power differently depending which field they are at a given moment. So, context and environments are the key influence of habitus. The fourth concept is symbolic power. And here he says that symbolic capital arises from an individual's social position. It includes the resources that come with prestige, honor, reputation, and so on. Bourdieu argued that symbolic capital is a crucial source of power. It can be accumulated through carrying out social obligations that come with much respect and honor, such as fighting in a war, and can be used to one's advantage. When working class habitants are degraded by schools and workplace, symbolic violence is exercised against the working class. Symbolic violence can be even more potent than physical violence in some way. This is because it imposes the will of the powerful on the powerless and reinforces the social order and what is acceptable in society. So social symbolic power kind of leads to violence, and over a violence is a symbolically indication of the legitimacy of those who are dominating, and it structures inequality. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.